You really stayed all night?
Your heart made me feel safe.
Lyra, we have company. Stay behind me.
You forget who the princess is.
Then show me the way. They're here for you.
Then they chose the wrong garden. No one steals my favorite pillow.
The reception on Kelvith Station occupied a spherical chamber at the equatorial ring, a space designed by a committee of 14 species and therefore pleasing to none of them. The lighting had been calibrated to a neutral spectrum that left everyone looking faintly unwell. The refreshment tables offered substances edible by most carbon-based delegates, which in practice meant small dishes of pressed grain and something that approximated water if you did not think too carefully about where it had come from. Marcus Vale stood near the eastern table and did what he had trained himself to do at these events. Be quiet, be still, be as close to invisible as a human could manage in a room full of beings who found humans, as a species, to be aggressively, almost alarmingly visible. 8 years he had been doing this. 8 years of following diplomatic missions through a dozen star systems, serving as cultural liaison, existing in galactic spaces in a way that would cause the minimum possible alarm. He had learned to modulate his voice before speaking in mixed company, because several species read quick vocal shifts as aggression. He had learned to keep his hands deliberately visible at all times, because others read fast hand movements as threat displays. He had learned to monitor his emotional responses and present a version of himself that his supervisor, Ambassador Yeren Chen, had once described as sufficiently legible to non-human interlocutors, which was the diplomatic way of saying, tone down enough that the room could relax. He was very good at it. He had gotten so good at it that he had started to wonder, in the quiet hours between briefings and receptions, whether the Marcus Vale who attended these events and the Marcus Vale who had signed on for this work in the first place were still the same person, or whether the second one had been sanded away so gradually that he had not noticed the loss until there was very little left. He held his water substitute and watched the room. The Varathi delegation clustered near the entrance in their geometric encounter suits, communicating in the subsonic registers that his translation implant struggled to keep pace with. The Keldar trade envoys, 6 of them, moving in their characteristic slow unison, occupied the center of the floor, their scent communication blooms cycling through what his cultural training told him was the equivalent of professional pleasantries. I acknowledge you. I wish you no harm. I am interested in commerce. The Athari contingent stood slightly apart from everyone else, as they always did, their slow light robes catching the neutral reception lighting and returning it as something warmer, as if the materials was quietly correcting the room's aesthetic failures. 7 Athari. He had memorized their faces before the assembly opened, because that was his job, and because he was good at his job, and the cost of the job was one of those things he thought about at 3 in the morning, and not at 8 in the evening at diplomatic receptions. Vorkalen, the high speaker, white-haired and steady, holding court with 3 council members near the far wall, the senior trade delegates, whose names he knew and whose file photographs matched their faces almost perfectly, except that photographs never quite captured the way slow light robes moved in real air. 2 attachés, and then, not quite part of the group, a figure near the floor-to-ceiling viewport on the station's outer edge, standing with her back to the reception, looking at the stars. Seriath Velkalen, junior ambassador, 43 years in assessment work, daughter of the high speaker, though the briefing notes added, somewhat pointedly, that she was known to resist the implication that this connection explained her appointment. She had 3 pages of academic credentials, 2 citations for diplomatic service in contested territories, and a notation from the previous assembly that read, assessment style, observational. Recommend minimal, direct contact during initial assembly period. She was one of the youngest delegates at the gathering by a significant margin, though young meant something different when the person in question had been doing her work since before Marcus was born. She was staring at the viewport as if the reception behind her had ceased to exist. Marcus recognized that posture. He had stood that way at a dozen events exactly like this one. He moved toward the viewport without deciding to. The transition from standing by the refreshment table to standing beside the window happened the way most things that changed his life happened. Quietly, without fanfare, in the space between one decision and the one he had not quite managed not to make. She heard him coming. Ethere's hearing was precise. She didn't turn around. "You're not watching the reception," she said. Her standard was excellent. Most senior Ethere diplomats had been speaking it for longer than Marcus had been alive, and she spoke it without the particular, careful deliberateness that characterized people who had learned a language rather than grown into it. "I've been watching it for 2 hours," Marcus said. "I've seen what there is to see." "What have you seen?" He considered the version of this answer that he had prepared for diplomatic contexts. Then, for reasons he could not entirely account for at the time, and would spend some days later trying to reconstruct, he said the other version instead. Everyone performing what they agreed to perform before they got here. She turned. Her eyes were deep amber, which his briefing notes told him was the Ethari baseline color. They shifted register in other circumstances, other emotional states, other contexts he didn't yet have a full reference for. She looked at him with careful, measuring attention that was not unfriendly but was very thorough. "What are you performing?" she asked. "Someone who belongs in this room," he said. A very slight pause. "And do any of us?" She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her expression, not dismissal, not agreement, something more tentative than either, something with the quality of a question being asked about a question. Then she turned back to the viewport. Beyond the glass, the station's outer ring curved away into the dark, and beyond that, the star field spread out in the particular configuration of this system, a trinary arrangement that produced a faint blue secondary glow along the lower right quadrant of the sky, a quality of light you could not see anywhere else in accessible space, because this was the only place where these 3 stars intersected at this angle, which was one of the reasons the station existed here, and one of the reasons no one had ever relocated it, despite several practical arguments in favor of doing so. The Celestial Garden's dome was visible from the viewport, a long teardrop structure running along the station's outer edge, lit from within by something warm and amber gold. "I have been looking at that," she said, nodding toward the dome, "for the last 20 minutes. The garden's open to delegates in off hours," Marcus said. He checked the time display on his inner reassembly session. "Ended 9 minutes ago." "Yes," she said. "It did." They stood there for a moment. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them moved immediately. Then they both moved toward the corridor exit at the same time, and neither of them commented on the coincidence, because it did not quite feel like one, and neither of them wanted to examine that feeling too closely. The garden's entrance required only delegate credentials. The attendant at the panel registered their IDs, looked at the two of them in the particular way of someone whose job is to note things without reacting to them, and cycled the inner door open. The air that came through was nothing like the recirculated neutrality of the reception hall. It was warm. It smelled of growing things, not any single plant Marcus could identify, just the general richness of biological activity, photosynthesis and soil moisture, and the faint green sweet of something in bloom somewhere in the distance. He stopped just inside the entrance because he had not expected it to feel this much like being somewhere real. In 8 years of diplomatic spaces, he had not encountered one that smelled like the outside. The garden stretched ahead of them for several hundred meters, a central path of pale stone, wound through plantings that were deliberately, carefully chaotic, a border of trees whose bark emitted a slow pulse of amber light, open sections of low silver-blue ground cover, a waterway that curved according to what appeared to be genuine caprice rather than design. The dome overhead had been set to night cycle, deep blue-black, scattered with lights that were almost but not quite real stars, slightly closer together than any actual constellation, slightly more symmetrical, the tell of something built by people who understood stars precisely well enough to reproduce them, imperfectly on purpose, or imperfectly enough that the perfection showed. Bioluminescent vines climbed the interior walls in a slow, overlapping riot of green and white and gold, each vine pulsing at its own tempo, so the overall effect was of something breathing, very slowly, on a scale larger than breathing usually operates. From somewhere ahead came a low continuous sound like wind over water, except there was no wind. The sound was produced by the circulation system's gentle currents moving through hanging seed clusters, thin, translucent pods strung on filaments from a tree Marcus didn't have a name for, chiming faintly and without pattern. He became aware that he had stopped walking and was simply standing there. Sariath had stopped 2 paces ahead of him, not looking back, not walking. Disorienting, she said. The first time. I haven't been in a garden that actually smelled like one, he said. Not in any diplomatic space. My people seeded this one, she said, approximately 3,000 years ago when the station was new. The intention was to make it feel like a place worth visiting rather than a place worth passing through. She paused. They succeeded, I think, though I find it easier to say so after the reception than during it. Come, she said. There's a better place to sit. The better place was a bench of carved pale stone at the edge of a long, shallow basin of light-reactive fluid, not a true lake but a depression in the garden floor filled with something that mirrored everything above it and added its own subtle iridescence, so the effect was of sitting at the center of a space twice as large as it actually was. The seed chime plants were dense here, their sound low and present. The amber trees stood close enough that their bark light pooled on the basin's surface in slow, overlapping rings of gold. They sat, not close, not quite far, sharing a bench the way 2 people share one when neither is certain what the other expects, and both are past the point of pretending the question doesn't exist. Why liaison work, she asked. Why ambassador work, he said. She looked at him sidelong. I asked first. He had prepared various versions of this answer for diplomatic contexts. He used none of them. I studied xenobotany, he said. Plants from off-world systems, the mechanics of how organisms grow in environments they didn't evolve in, what they keep, what they change, what they lose. And then I realized that the question I was actually interested in was the same question you get when you look at how cultures function in contact with cultures they did not develop alongside. What stays? What adapts? What disappears without anyone intending it to? He paused, so the work felt familiar, even when the subject matter was entirely new. You find plants easier to understand than people. I find plants easier to understand than species, he said. I have the same difficulty with people that most people have. What difficulty is that? We confuse each other regularly, he said, without trying to. Sometimes, especially when we're trying not to. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but had its shadow. My work is assessment, she said. I evaluate how much contact is advisable between ethery interests and the species we encounter, and of what quality, and through what channels. I have been in this work for 43 years. He did the calculation silently. By ethery standards, she was still considered relatively early in her career. By his, 43 years covered most of his life. Does the difference bother you? He asked. When you're working with humans, she considered it with the same care she seemed to bring to all questions, the pause of someone who does not have the answer already prepared and is actually looking for one. I don't know what to do with it, she said finally. I can calculate it, account for it in my assessments, but knowing, in a practical and immediate sense, that the being across from me will be old by the time I have held this position for a century, and that I will keep holding it when they are gone, and that I still find the present conversation worth having. I have not found the right framework for all of that. It sits outside my frameworks. A pause. Does it bother you? The reverse of it. Knowing I age faster than most of the people I work with in galactic spaces. Yes, he thought about it honestly. I've learned to stop tracking it, he said, which I think is probably not the same as not being bothered. But it's the solution I arrived at. She looked at him. That is the most diplomatic thing you've said tonight, she said. He almost laughed. Is that a criticism? It was an observation, she said. Most of the rest has been something else. They sat in quiet for a moment. The basin cycled through a slow color shift, moving from gold toward a deep blue-green, as the dome lighting made some adjustment. The seed clusters chimed above them in the circulation currents. Tell me something specific that you miss, she said. From Earth, not the general shape of it. Something particular. The question surprised him. Not the question itself, but the phrasing something particular, which was not the phrasing of someone running a diplomatic checklist. Thunder, he said, and he had not thought of it in months, but the word came immediately, with the weight of something real. Explain that. It starts in your chest before it reaches your ears, he said. There's a pressure first, a physical sensation, like something enormous is happening very close by, before you hear anything at all. And the sound comes, and it's huge and brief, and it rolls away. And there's nothing else that feels like that. You live with it for your whole life, and you don't know how much you rely on it until you're somewhere that doesn't have weather. She was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a diplomatic pause. I will not be able to account for that in any assessment I write, she said. It was not a complaint. It sounded like someone noting a genuine gap in their tools. What do etheri miss? He asked. When you're away from home, the ratio, she said. There is a specific quality of light in the home system during the long evenings, a particular ratio of illuminated surface to shadow that has never been successfully reproduced anywhere else. Every calculation we have for it says it should be replicable. Every reproduction is missing something. We have been trying to identify the missing element for 900 years. She paused. No one knows what it is. It simply is not there, in any reproduction, and everyone who has spent time at home and then left knows the difference immediately, and no instrument we have has been precise enough to name what it is we are measuring. What does the reproduction feel like? He asked. The one with something missing? She thought about it. Like a sentence, she said, where the last word is correct, but the rhythm is wrong. He looked at her. She was facing the basin, and the amber tree's slow light moved across her profile in the way light moves when it has enough space to be gradual, and she looked like someone who had said something true that she had not planned to say, and was now holding very still in the aftermath of it. He did not try to fill the space. He let it sit. They talked for a long time after that, not about policy, not about the Assembly's agenda or humanity's pending status review, or the 17 procedural motions that had been filed in the last 3 sessions. They talked about the things they actually noticed, the way the seed clusters changed their tone when the circulation rate shifted, the quality of light when all the amber trees pulsed simultaneously, a deep collective gold that made the basin briefly look like something molten. The fact that this manufactured garden felt almost like a real one, but not quite, and what that almostness communicated about the people who built it and what they were trying to hold on to. He told her about his first off-world posting a transfer station near Castrath's orbital belt, 14 months in spaces where there was no natural horizon anywhere he could see. Only hull walls and deck plating, and the occasional viewport onto a star field that, however beautiful, did not constitute a horizon in any meaningful sense, and how that had changed the way he thought about ground. Not as a surface, but as a reference point, the thing everything else measured itself against, and how without it, you had to keep rebuilding the reference from scratch every morning, using whatever fixed points you could find. She told him about a contested assessment zone where she had spent 6 months in spaces so legally disputed that the room she slept in changed territorial classification 4 times while she was in it. A room in Etheri administered at midnight that was technically Varathi, commercial territory by morning, and had reverted to neutral status by the time she left for her work. She had learned, she said, to think about ownership entirely differently during those months, not as a fixed property of things, but as a negotiated fact, real only because enough parties agreed that it was real, and therefore real in a way that depended entirely on continued agreement, which was more fragile and more remarkable than people who had never watched it fail tended to appreciate. He said he thought that was a more accurate description of ownership than most of the ones he had grown up with. She said she had come to the same conclusion, but that it was one of those conclusions that changed how you saw almost everything, and was therefore inconvenient. The dome cycle had reached its deepest point, the overhead lighting reduced to the pure ambient glow of the plants and the basin, and the almost stars in their arranged constancy. The bench was warm from the garden's internal heating. The seed clusters chimed. She asked him the question sometime after midnight, by station reckoning. "Have you ever done something that mattered?" she said, without knowing at the time that it mattered. He sat with it the way it deserved to be sat with. The story came out slowly, without drama. 6 months at a job he had stayed at past any rational point, past the point where the work suited him, past the point where his skills were well used, past the point of making sense professionally, because a colleague he was fond of was going through something he only half understood, and he had not been able to bring himself to leave while she was in the middle of it. He had not made the decision consciously. He had simply failed, repeatedly and without much deliberation, to make the opposite decision, and afterward, she said. 3 months after I left, she told me that those 6 months were the only steady thing she had, that she had looked at my desk every morning and known that one thing was not changing, that it had made the rest of it survivable. He paused. I had not known I was doing that. I was not doing that consciously. I just hadn't done anything else. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he became aware of how quiet it was, and then long enough that he stopped being aware of the quiet and simply waited, without pressure, without expectation. That is the thing about humans, she said, that I have not been able to put into my assessments. What is? You do things that matter, she said, without having calculated that they will matter. You arrive at the right action by a path that isn't a path. You simply find yourselves there. She said it without condescension, without the slight framing of inferiority that he had learned to listen for in diplomatic contexts. She said it the way someone says something they have been thinking about for a long time and have not previously been able to put into words that satisfied them. Every other spacefaring species I have assessed operates inside a framework. Even when the framework is wrong, even when the action is disastrous, there is always a framework, a reason, a calculation from first principles to conclusion. And then there is what humans do, and it resists the framework entirely. And the result is sometimes terrible, and sometimes, she stopped, sometimes it is the right thing, arrived at by no process I can trace. What's wrong with not having a framework, he asked. Nothing, she said, and then after a pause, that is what I cannot put in my assessments. He did not have an answer for that. He did not look for one. He let the observation stand, and they sat in the warmth and the low light, and the sound of the seed clusters. And at some point after that, he could not have said when, and would later spend some time trying to identify the exact moment. Without success, he stopped monitoring his words. The shift happened the way warmth returns when you have been cold too long to remember being warm, gradually, and then all at once. And you notice it only when you realize that you have been comfortable for a while, without thinking to remark on it. He talked the way he had talked in his first year in graduate school, when everything had been new and difficult and strange, and he had still operated on the assumption that the stranger a conversation became, the more it was worth having. He had stopped talking that way a long time ago and could not have said precisely when. It came back without his asking for it. The basin's surface rippled with some gentle adjustment in the circulation system. The amber trees pulsed once, all together, and then settled back into their quiet individual rhythms. He became aware, by slow degrees, that the conversation had gone still. He thought he had simply paused mid-thought, reaching for the next word, and then realized the pause had been going on, longer than a pause ordinarily goes on. He looked to his left. Sarioth had drifted toward him, not a large movement, a slow, incremental drift, the kind produced by genuine sleep, by gravity and the release of muscle tension, by the body going where it goes when the will that ordinarily manages its position has stepped away. Her shoulder was against his arm. Her head had settled onto his chest. She was asleep. He went completely still. Thinking about it would have required accessing some section of his training, a protocol, a cultural guideline, some piece of his 8 years of work about what appropriate contact between human and Athari delegates was and was not. All of that would have taken time and attention, and he was afraid to take time, afraid to shift even the small amount required to think clearly. She was asleep. She was asleep on him. She looked like herself, not the ambassador, not the 3 pages of credentials, not the assessment professional, with 43 years in the work. Just herself, in the quiet of the garden, at whatever hour this was, with the amber light moving slow and even across her face, and she looked like a person who had finally stopped having to be something other than a person. He did not move. He had not calculated this. He had not prepared for it. He did not know the significance of it, and he would not know the significance of it for another 12 hours. And, even if he had known, he was not certain it would have changed anything, because there are situations in which the only decent thing is to hold very still and let someone rest, and this appeared to be one of them. He sat. He held still. He felt the slow numbness starting in his left side from the awkward angle, and he noted it and dismissed it, and held still some more. The dome's lights were doing their pre-dawn cycle, a warming that crept inward from the ceiling's edges over the course of what must have been close to an hour. So gradual, it was not light so much as the slow withdrawal of darkness, the world returning to visibility by increments so small you would have missed any single one. He watched the garden come back to itself in the artificial morning, and he was very quiet, and she slept. She was asleep for approximately 3.5 hours by his reckoning, long enough that his left arm went from numb to something past numb into a deep, distant ache that he was aware of the way you are aware of weather you cannot do anything about, and he held still through all of it, because she looked like she needed it, and he did not want to take it away from her, and that was all the reason he had. She woke before the light reached its full intensity. Her eyes opened with a particular quality returning, a coming back from somewhere distant and deep. She lay still for a moment, not yet moving, simply registering where she was. Then she began to sit up, and Marcus felt the specific and located loss of warmth as a thing with a shape. "I apologize," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, slightly unsteady at the edges. "I don't," she stopped. "Reset. I don't sleep like that." "You look like you needed it," he said. "That is not what I mean," she said. "I mean that it doesn't happen. Not like that." Something was working through her expression that he didn't have a name for. Ethery sleep cycles are semi-conscious, voluntary. We maintain a minimum level of awareness even in deep rest because our autonomic systems, it takes specific conditions to deactivate that response, conditions that take years to develop. What just happened? She stopped again. That doesn't happen. "Well," he said, "just the fact of it, simple and plain and true. It happened." She looked at him. Her eyes had shifted from their baseline amber to something darker, a shade without a name in any chart he had. Something moved through her face that had the quality of a decision being finalized, not made in the moment, but finalized. The way decisions finalize when they've been building long enough to have found their form. "Whatever happens next," she said, quietly and carefully, "I need you to remember that I chose." He opened his mouth to ask her what she meant. Chose what? Chose when? What was she expecting to happen? And the garden's entrance panel lit up on the far side of the dome. Through the glass of the doors, he could see 3 figures in Kelvith Station security uniforms standing in the corridor outside. And the moment he was in became a different moment, and would remain that different moment going forward, without his permission. The separation was quick and professional. The security coordinator, a woman named Officer Tetha Rallin, according to her badge, explained in extremely practiced and precisely neutral standard that both delegates were being requested to follow separate personnel for what she called clarification procedures related to off-hours access. She said off-hours access with the inflection of someone, describing something considerably more significant than the phrase suggested, but whose operational instructions do not allow her to use more accurate language. Marcus followed. He didn't have a better option. He caught a glimpse of Seriath across the corridor, 2 Ethery station liaisons flanking her, one speaking to her in low, rapid Ethery that his translation implant couldn't keep pace with. She looked from across the corridor's width, like someone who had made a decision and was now standing inside it, completely still. Their eyes met for a moment. She didn't say anything. Then the doors between them closed, and the moment was over. He was taken to a small room in the station's administrative sector. Not a cell. It had a proper chair, a picture, indirect lighting along the walls in the Ethery style, which illuminated the surface rather than the air, and made the room feel slightly larger than it was. Not a cell, but not a comfortable waiting room either. The kind of space that exists in the careful middle ground between assistance and custody, designed by people who understood that the middle ground was where most things happened and needed to be prepared for. Ambassador Yeren Chen arrived 11 minutes later. He had worked with Yeren for 3 of his 8 years, which was long enough to read her face with reasonable accuracy. What her face said when she came through the door was, "The situation is considerably worse than I would like it to be, and I am currently in the process of deciding how much of that to communicate." And how quickly she sat across from him. She did not immediately speak. She set a data tablet face down on the table and looked at him. "Tell me," she said, "what happened, in order, from when the session ended." He told her. The receptions, the viewport, Seriath, the garden, the conversation. He did not summarize it. He told it the way it had gone, in sequence, without editorial framing. He told her about falling asleep. He told her about what he'd found when the process completed and woken him, and what he'd done, which was to remain still. He told her about her waking up, and what she'd said, and what he had and hadn't understood about it. He finished. She had not interrupted once. She picked up the data tablet, turned it over, and looked at the screen for a moment without showing it to him. "How much do you know," she said, "about the celestial witnessing?" He knew the phrase. It was in the assembly's background materials, the thick preparatory documents his team had distributed 2 weeks before the session began. The cultural overview section, near the end, in the historical context subsection. The Celestial Garden, the documents noted, was a site of significant historical importance to the Ethari people, having been established at the beginning of their engagement with Galactic Contact Law as a demonstration of their commitment to open exchange. The witnessing was mentioned in a parenthetical as a historical ceremonial practice, something from the early period of galactic formation. He had read it and moved on. It's historical, he said. A ceremony from the founding period. The background documents called it a ceremonial practice. The background documents, Yeren said, are incomplete. She turned the tablet and slid it across the table so he could see the screen. It showed a legal document in 3 languages, with a section highlighted in the machine translation into standard. The celestial witnessing is fully operative galactic law under the primordial charter. It was established 3,000 years ago. It has not been invoked in 1,100 years because the conditions required for a valid witnessing have not occurred in 1,100 years. Until last night. He read the highlighted section. He read it a second time. The Celestial Garden on Kelveth Station, he said, slowly, is the sanctuary of witnessing. It is the original sanctuary of witnessing, the site where the ritual was codified. This is why the Ethari established it here when the station was new. This is why they have maintained it for 3,000 years. The garden is not an amenity. It is a legal instrument. He read the highlighted passage a third time, more carefully. The language was old, rendered into standard in a translation style that preserved the original's rhythms even where those rhythms were not quite natural in the target language. A recognized species member inviting an unrecognized species member to rest in the sanctuary through the full night cycle. Rest that was genuine and peaceful and mutually voluntary. The monitoring systems of the sanctuary recording the biological signatures of both parties throughout, and at the cycle's end, if the conditions were met, the unrecognized species received the status of witnessed. What does witnessed status mean, he said, specifically. Yeren had clearly prepared this explanation. She gave it clearly and without preamble. A witnessed species could not be denied galactic citizenship under the Charter, could not be subjected to expansion restrictions without a full council vote requiring unanimity, and the council, in its entire history, had never achieved unanimity on anything, could not be legally sanctioned for settlement of any uncontested territory. The status was essentially permanent and not subject to review. Once a species had been witnessed, the question of whether they belonged in galactic space was closed. He let this settle. Humanity's status review, the one that had been the actual substantive purpose of this assembly, beneath the diplomatic pleasantries and the procedural sessions, had not been going well before the gathering began. 2 major species had filed formal concerns about the rate of human colonial expansion. A third had proposed a resolution that would have established hard caps on the number of systems humanity could settle over the next century. The vote projections before the assembly opened had shown that resolution passing 5-2. He knew this. It was in the briefing documents too, the ones that were complete. And Sariath knew, he said. Yeren did not answer directly. The Ethari have filed a formal challenge with the council, she said. They are arguing that the witnessing is invalid because Ambassador Sariath Velkalin entered the garden and engaged in the ceremony with deliberate strategic intent. The charter is explicit that a witnessing cannot be manufactured by the recognized species member. The invitation must be genuine. The act must be genuine. They are arguing that hers was not. She knew, Marcus said again. We don't know, Yeren said carefully, the full picture of what she knew and when and what she intended at every point during the evening, which is what the hearing will determine. She folded her hands on the table. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to consider your answer carefully, because it will matter. In the time you spent with Ambassador Sariath in the garden, in anything she said, or did you have any reason to believe she was aware of the garden's legal significance? He thought about it. He went through the evening carefully. The way you go through a building, you need to know the layout of systematically, not rushing past any room. Nothing she said indicated it, he said. We talked about xenobotany and assessment work, about thunder and what Ethari miss from home, about what it's like to represent your species in spaces that weren't built for you. He paused. We didn't talk about the charter. She didn't mention the witnessing. Good, Yeren said. Then, more specifically, that is good, because that is the shape of the position we're going to need to build. She slid a single sheet across the table. He picked it up and read it. It was brief, a formal statement, in standard and in the 3 primary languages of the Council's proceedings, characterizing the events of the previous night as arising from cultural unfamiliarity with the garden's ceremonial significance and acknowledging that no valid witnessing could be said to have occurred where informed consent was absent from both parties, and therefore formally withdrawing any claim to witness status that might otherwise be inferred from the events in question. The Athari delegation has requested you sign this, Yeren said. It provides a resolution that both sides can accept without. It withdraws the witnessing, he said. It acknowledges certain ambiguities in the validity of the. It withdraws the witnessing, he said, and humanity loses the status that was never formally ours to begin with, Yeren said, and in her voice he could hear the cost of saying it, the weight of someone who believed in the work and had learned, by careful painful increments, to prioritize what was possible over what was right, because the gap between them had turned out to be the actual landscape of the work. Marcus. The Athari have moved fleet vessels to defensive posture within the system. 3 other species have filed procedural objections this morning. If this goes to a contested formal hearing before the full council, it will be the most significant galactic legal event in more than a century, and the outcome is not guaranteed, and in the meantime, the relationships that keep this region of space stable. What happens to Sariath, he said. If I sign. A pause. Her career is protected. Vorkalen has indicated that if the witnessing is quietly withdrawn, there will be no formal disciplinary action. She returns to her assessment role. The matter is closed. And if I don't. Another pause, longer, with a different quality. There is a formal hearing. Your testimony about what you knew and when you knew, it is central to the case. The outcome depends on the council's interpretation of the evidence, and on how the second condition of the witnessing is evaluated, and on. She stopped. The outcome is uncertain. He looked at the statement on the table. The language was careful. The language was diplomatic. The language was designed to make the thing it was doing sound like a reasonable and mutual clarification, rather than a relinquishment. Before he could say anything more, the door opened and a new figure entered the room. The council official who came in wore the gray of a neutral arbiter, and he carried nothing, no tablet, no documents, and he moved with the unhurried precision of someone whose entire professional life had been structured around never appearing to be in a hurry. Mr. Vale, the official said, sitting down across from him. I am Councillor Braith, serving as the council's neutral arbiter for proceedings related to this matter. I would like to ask you a small number of questions about the events of last night. I want to assure you that your answers will be considered in their full context. He paused. At what point in the evening did you become aware that Ambassador Sariath Velkalen had entered a state of sleep against you? Marcus noticed the specificity of the question. The question was not, what happened in the garden? The question was not, did you know what the garden was? The question was, at what point did you become aware that she was asleep? The question was about his awareness, his perception, the precise moment of his understanding of a specific state. Sometime after midnight by station reckoning, Marcus said, I don't have an exact time. I noticed that she had stopped speaking, and then I noticed that her position had changed, and then I understood that she was asleep. And you remained in that position for approximately, how long after that? Until she woke up. Approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. You did not move during that period. No, why not? Marcus looked at Councillor Braith. He thought about the various ways to answer this question. The diplomatic version. The version that sounded considered and strategic and therefore safe. She looked like she needed it, he said. I didn't want to wake her up. Braith held his gaze for a moment. He wrote something on the small device he had produced from somewhere, briefly and without visible reaction, and then asked 7 more questions, all of them circling the same territory. What had Marcus known about the garden before entering? What had been said during the evening? At what moments had he been aware of what? And none of them, not a single one, were about Sariath's intent. They were about his awareness, his state of knowledge, his experience of the night from the inside. After Braith left, Yaren stayed for another few minutes. She told him again that the statement was available for him to sign, that the window for doing so was not unlimited, that the pragmatic case for signing it was strong, and the risks of not signing it were real. He listened to all of it. He looked at the statement. He picked it up. He read it again slowly. The language was careful. He put it back on the table. "I need some time," he said. She looked at him. She had the expression of someone who already knew the outcome and was deciding whether to say so. She didn't say it. She left him with the statement and the pitcher of water and the indirect lighting and the particular silence of a room where something is about to be decided. He sat for a long time in that silence. The thing he kept returning to was not the legal analysis or the political calculus or the list of consequences that Yaren had laid out with precision and genuine concern. The thing he kept returning to was this: the night had been real, not manufactured, not performed. Real, in the way that the only handful of things in his 8 years of this work had been real the moment at a transfer station when he and a Varathi engineer had managed, despite every language barrier and every cultural difference, to laugh at the same thing at the same time. The moment in a contested corridor when he had helped a Keldar delegate who was having a medical episode, without thinking, without checking whether the protocol allowed for it, just because the being in front of him needed help. Small moments. Moments that did not appear in his assessments or his reports. Moments that had kept him in the work when everything else argued for leaving. The night in the garden was the realest thing that had happened to him in 8 years of being professionally careful. He could not sign a document saying it hadn't been what it was. He set the statement aside. He looked at the room's viewport, which showed a narrow slice of the station's outer ring, and beyond it, visible at the edge of the frame, the teardrop dome of the celestial garden, still lit from within in the warm amber of its morning cycle. He looked at it for a long time, and he did not sign the statement, and he waited to find out what came next. They gave him access to the council's legal archive on the morning of the second day. Not unrestricted access, mediated access, through a research terminal in a small room off the administrative wing, with a council-assigned information officer standing near the door who did not speak unless spoken to. Marcus understood that this access was not a courtesy. It was a calculation. A party who understood the legal framework would be easier to predict and manage than one who did not. He searched for witnessing. He found it. The Primordial Charter, Article 14, Section 3, and all its subsections. The text was old in the way that legal documents get old when they have survived unchanged across 3,000 years, old in the rhythm of its phrasing, in the way it chose words, as if language itself were a recent and somewhat uncertain development worth handling with care. He read it in machine-translated standard and then, through the information officer, requested access to the annotated scholarly commentary, updated 4 centuries ago, which was the most recent revision on record. The garden had been established by the Athari at the formation of Galactic Contact Law. Its purpose, the founding document said, was to provide a site where the question of which species belonged in the compact of galactic civilization could be answered by something other than vote or conquest 2 mechanisms. The document noted, with the dryness that old legal texts acquire from long experience of the things they were written to prevent, which had historically produced unreliable results. The mechanism of witnessing was this: if a member of a recognized species and a member of an unrecognized species spent the full cycle of the garden's artificial night in simple, peaceful coexistence in genuine rest, without performance, without management, without the particular kind of vigilance that manufactured presence always produces, then the unrecognized species had demonstrated what the Charter called the capacity for witness. The capacity to be simply present, the capacity to rest in the presence of the genuinely unknown. And that capacity, the document argued, with the patient conviction of something written by people who had thought about it very carefully, was sufficient, was in fact the only thing that was sufficient. Everything else, technology, expansion, military capability, diplomatic sophistication, those things could be developed, could be taught, could be acquired. The capacity for witness either existed in a species or it didn't. He read that paragraph 3 times. The annotation, which had the more expansive and slightly more skeptical tone of scholarship produced 4 centuries later, expanded on the founding document's logic. The witnessing had not been designed as a political instrument. It had been designed on the premise that species capable of sophisticated political manipulation were also, by the nature of what political sophistication required, incapable of the specific and unusual kind of presence the ritual demanded. A calculation would show up in the behavior, in the watchfulness, the micro-adjustments, the maintenance of strategic positioning, the absence of true rest. Genuine presence would not show those things. The garden's monitoring systems, established at the sanctuary's founding and continuously refined over 3 millennia, had been calibrated to distinguish between them. The commentary added that no attempt to game the systems had ever been successful. In either direction, beings who were genuinely resting registered as genuinely resting, and beings who were pretending to rest registered as pretending, and the systems were very patient and very thorough and had a longer institutional memory than any individual who had ever tried to outwit them. He sat with this for a while. Then, he found what he was looking for, or rather, what he had been afraid of finding. The clause governing the recognized species member's intent. If the ethery member, who invited or accompanied the unrecognized species member into the garden, had done so with deliberate strategic intent specifically, with the intent to extend witnessed status to the unrecognized species, then the witnessing was invalid. Because a manufactured invitation was not an invitation. Because the whole architecture of the ceremony depended on both parties arriving in the garden without an agenda. And, if one of them had an agenda, the question the ceremony was designed to answer had not actually been asked. He closed the document. He did not open another one immediately. He thought carefully and in detail about the evening, about the viewport, about the things she had said when they moved toward the garden at the same time, the careful language she had used, the way it had felt less like coincidence and more like the converging of two things that had been heading in the same direction separately, about the question she had asked him whether he had ever done something important without knowing why, about whatever it was that had been in her face when she said, "Whatever happens next, remember that I chose." She had known. She had known what the garden was, and she had gone into it with him, and what followed had followed. He sat with this knowledge for a long time. The problem with it, the problem he kept running into, from every direction he approached it, was that it did not account for the whole night. It accounted for the beginning of the night. It accounted for the choice of venue, the choice of timing, possibly the choice of him specifically. It did not account for the conversation that had followed, which had been the most honest conversation he had had in 8 years of carefully managed professional speech. It did not account for the question about thunder, or the admission about the light ratio, or the long silences that had not been uncomfortable, or the moment somewhere past midnight when he had stopped monitoring what he said and simply said things. It did not account, above all, for the fact that she had fallen asleep, not drifted into semi-consciousness, not maintained the minimum vigilance that ethery sleep cycles maintained by design, fallen asleep completely and involuntarily, against a person she had met 4 hours ago. He knew this was significant. He did not yet know exactly how significant. He was in the process of understanding it. He closed the archive and stared at the terminal screen. The possibility he was circling was the one that hurt. That the whole evening had been a performance. That the conversation had been chosen for him, the way the venue had been chosen for him because his biometric profile looked relaxed, or because she'd assessed that he was the kind of person who responded to a certain kind of honesty, or because she'd calculated that a particular kind of genuine seeming connection was what the evening required, that he had been read correctly and in detail and deployed accordingly, and the connection he had felt was the connection she had engineered. He did not want this to be true. He was aware that not wanting something to be true was not evidence that it wasn't. He sat in the archive room for a long time and thought about it and arrived at no clean conclusion, and eventually went back to his room. In a different section of the station, in a conference room that required delegate-level clearance to access, a different conversation was taking place. Vor Kalin, High Speaker of the Galactic Council, was seated at one end of a small table. His slow-light robe was immaculate. His white hair was precisely arranged. His deep green eyes, the color that a ethery cultural documentation associated with long experience and accumulated judgment, were fixed on the other end of the table with the particular steady quality of someone who has been exercising tremendous control for some time and intends to continue. Across from him, Sariath. I need you to tell me, Vorkalin said, that this was not what it appears to be. I cannot tell you that, Sariath said. You brought a human into the sanctuary. On the final night of the observation period, you knew the implications. He wasn't brought, she said. We went together. You knew the implications, Vorkalin said again. He did not. Yes. The table between them held nothing. No documents, no devices. This was not a working meeting. Then you used the Charter's most sacred provision as a mechanism, Vorkalin said. His voice was even. You used something my people have maintained for 3,000 years as an instrument for. I chose the garden, she said. I chose the timing, a pause. I chose him. She met her father's eyes. I didn't choose everything that happened after that. Vorkalin looked at her for a long moment. In his expression, visible only because she had been reading his face for 120 years, was something more complex than anger. Something with the quality of a parent who has watched a child do something that can't be undone, and is now trying to calculate both the cost and whether the cost changes anything. The formal challenge is filed, he said. The hearing will proceed. If you testify accurately about your intent at the start of the evening, the challenge has merit, and the witnessing can be invalidated. He paused. Your career survives. The resolution passes. Humanity's expansion is managed. The galactic order that has maintained stability for 600 years remains intact. Another pause. If you testify otherwise, I will testify accurately, she said. Sariath. He said her name with the weight of a word that means I know you better than anyone and I am asking you to hear me. This species has been spacefaring for 200 years. The models show projections, she said. They show what the numbers look like if everything continues exactly as it has been continuing. They don't show what the numbers look like if something unexpected changes. If something unexpected is already in the process of changing. She looked at him. I spent a night in the garden talking to a human about thunder and about the light ratio that we cannot replicate and about what it means to do something important without knowing that you are doing it. And I fell asleep. She let that sit for a moment. I would like you to think about what it means that I fell asleep. Vorkalin was quiet. Whatever you think about their expansion models, she said, I would like you to think about that. At the door of the conference room, positioned in the standing observation posture assigned to junior delegates at formal discussions, Delegate Amy did not move. She was 7 years into her work, young for Ethery, still developing the professional stillness that the role required. Her face was sufficiently controlled that a casual observer would not have detected the thing that moved through it when Vorkalin implied, carefully and in diplomatic language, that Marcus Vale had been a means to an end, that the connection had been a calculation, that whatever Sariath had experienced was an instrument she had used. Because what she saw in Sariath's face when her father said that when he used the phrase mechanism for the second time was not the expression of a strategist whose strategy had been exposed. She filed this observation somewhere private and continued to stand still and continued to watch. Marcus didn't learn about that conversation. What he received sometime in the second evening was a piece of physical paper slipped under the door of his room. Paper was sufficiently unusual in the station's administrative wing that its use was clearly deliberate. The note on it said, in clean printed standard, she didn't have to choose you, she just did. No signature, no indication of origin. He held it for a long time. He thought about the two facts together, that she had known what the garden was, and that she had fallen asleep. He thought about what she had told him about Ethari's sleep cycles, that they were semi-conscious, voluntary, controlled, that the involuntary version required conditions that took years to build. He thought about the look on her face when she woke up and found herself on his chest, not the look of someone whose plan had concluded, not the look of someone whose mechanism had functioned correctly. Something else, something he had not been able to name then and still could not name precisely now, but which he thought had the shape of a person discovering they are somewhere different from where they intended to be, and not knowing whether to be alarmed or grateful, and choosing, in the end, to stay. He put the note in his pocket. That evening, Yeren came to his room. She told him the formal hearing was scheduled for the following morning. His testimony would be central to the proceedings. The Ethery had 3 witnesses prepared to testify that the witnessing had been deliberately orchestrated. Without a compelling counter-argument, the outcome was unlikely to favor humanity's position. "What kind of testimony are you planning to give?" she asked. Marcus sat with that for a moment. "The truth," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at things she had calculated and found suboptimal. "Marcus, the truth," he said again. "The whole thing in order. What happened? And if the council determines that the truth is insufficient too, then it's insufficient," he said. "But I'm not going to walk in there and tell them a version of events that is carefully arranged to protect me. I wasn't trying to protect myself since I was in the garden. I was trying not to wake someone up. That's the truth of what happened. And I think it's the only truth that will actually work. And I think I have to say it because it's true. And those two things are the same in this case. And I'm going to hold on to that." Yaron was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Get some sleep." She left. He sat in the quiet of the room and thought about what the truth was, exactly not its shape in the abstract, but how to say it in front of a full council session in a way that remained true in the saying of it. In his experience, truth was the easiest thing to distort through the wrong kind of emphasis, the wrong kind of framing, the too careful word in the wrong position. He was not going to do that. He was going to walk in and say what had happened and why he had done what he did, and if that was not sufficient, at least it would be accurate. He went to sleep. It was the most straightforward sleep he had managed in 8 years of being professionally careful. The council's formal hearing chamber was a sphere, because spherical architecture distributed authority equally across available volume, and no single point in a sphere has natural precedence over any other. This was the theory. In practice, the high speaker's position was elevated by a quarter of the sphere's radius, meaning everyone in the lower hemisphere spent the proceedings looking faintly upward, which was not accidental, and which anyone with any familiarity with how power worked in physical space would recognize immediately. Marcus was brought in through a lower entrance at the chamber's equatorial line. Yaron accompanied him to the delegate threshold, and then he crossed it alone and walked to the testimony position at the center of the chamber floor. The position was marked by a slight rise in the floor material and a subtle change in the ambient lighting. Nothing dramatic, just enough to indicate that this was where you stood if you were the one speaking and everyone else would face you. He had stood in galactic formal spaces before, a dozen of them across 8 years. He had always managed his presentation in those spaces, calibrated his voice, monitored his posture, delivered contributions that were measured and useful and careful. He had always been aware of the way he was received, the cataloging, the assessment, the continuous evaluation of whether he was legible, whether he was safe, whether he was acceptable. He was aware of it now, standing at the center of this sphere with every delegate position occupied and the weight of 40-some sets of non-human eyes on him. He felt it the way he always felt it. He decided in that moment to stop managing it. The decision did not feel like courage. It felt like something simpler, the recognition that he had been managing his presentation for 8 years, and it had gotten him to a hearing room where he was going to testify about a night he had not managed at all. And the unmanaged night was the one that mattered, and he could not speak accurately about it from inside the managed version. Counselor Braith was presiding. He sat at a position slightly below the high speaker's elevation and slightly above the delegates, which was precisely correct for a neutral arbiter, and told Marcus that Braith understood where he stood in relation to everyone in the room. Vorkalen sat at the apex, which was also precisely correct, and told Marcus something different. "Mr. Vale," Counselor Braith said, "you have been asked to describe the events of the night in question in your own words. Please proceed." Marcus took a breath.
"Ambassador Seriath Vel Kalen and I were both attending the reception in the equatorial chamber," he said. "We had both been there for approximately 2 hours.
We were both standing near the viewport on the outer wall, separately when we began talking. The assembly session had ended 9 minutes before. The garden was open to delegates. We both moved toward the corridor exit at approximately the same time." He described the garden in detail, not the atmospheric version, not the diplomatic version, the one he had actually seen, the smell of it, the sound of the seed clusters, the amber trees in the basin. He described what they had talked about, specifically, the work, thunder, the light ratio, the things people actually said when they stopped trying to say the right things. He was specific because specificity is what the truth looks like, and generalization is what substitution looks like. And he wanted whatever he said to be clearly identifiable as one and not the other. At some point after midnight by station reckoning, he said, I noticed that Ambassador Sarioth had fallen asleep against me. The chamber was quiet in the way that chambers get quiet when something is being heard rather than merely listened to. I want to be clear about what I knew at that point, Marcus said. I did not know anything about the witnessing ceremony. I had read the phrase in the assembly background materials, and the background materials described it as a historical practice, and I had not investigated further. I did not know that the garden was the sanctuary of witnessing. I did not know that there was any legal significance to the night at all. He paused. What I knew was that she was asleep, that she was in a position against me from which if I moved, she would wake up, and that she looked like she needed the sleep. Another pause. I didn't move. I stayed in that position for approximately 3.5 to 4 hours until she woke up on her own. A delegate from the Varathi section raised a formal question marker. Braith acknowledged it. Cross-examination opened. Counselor Vihan was the Varathi questioner senior, unhurried, deliberate in the specific way of someone who had been conducting formal interrogations for long enough that the form had become second nature. Mr. Vale, he said, you have stated that you had no knowledge of the witnessing protocol before entering the garden. That is correct. The Celestial Garden is referenced in the background materials distributed to all assembly delegates prior to the session. It is, as a historically significant site, seated by the Etheri 3,000 years ago, maintained as a demonstration of commitment to open exchange. The witnessing is mentioned once, in the historical context subsection, as a ceremonial practice from the founding period. There is no indication in the materials that the protocol remains operative under the Charter. Vane considered this. If you had known, he said, choosing the conditional carefully, that spending a peaceful night in the garden with an Etheri delegate could confer galactic witnessed status on humanity, would you have done what you did? Marcus looked at him. He thought about the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer and because this was not the moment for anything else. Probably not, he said. If I had known the legal significance, I would have been afraid of getting it wrong, afraid of it meaning something it shouldn't mean, or of doing something that could be interpreted as strategic when it wasn't. I would have found a very good reason to get up. I'm very good at finding reasons to get up. Then it is your position, Vane said, that your ignorance of the ceremony is what validated your participation in it. My position, Marcus said, is that I stayed because she looked like she needed the rest, and I did not want to take that away from her. That is the complete position. I don't have a legal argument. I have a reason, and the reason is that simple, and I am not going to dress it up as something more complicated, because it isn't. Vane was quiet. He exchanged a glance with his colleague that Marcus could read only as, this is not going the way we anticipated. Why, Vane said, picking the question with visible care, would a human diplomat operating in a charged diplomatic context, representing a species whose status was actively under review, choose to prioritize the physical comfort of an Etheri ambassador over his own freedom of movement, over any strategic consideration of what the night might mean, over every professional instinct his 8 years of work should have trained him to follow? Because she was asleep, Marcus said, and she needed the rest, and I had 4 hours and a numb shoulder, and I spent them being glad she was resting. That is not a calculation. That is just what you do. That is, he stopped for a moment, because what he was about to say was true, and he wanted to say it correctly. That is what you do when you are present with someone who is resting, and you understand that the present moment is the one that counts, and everything else can wait. The chamber held the kind of silence that comes after something that has not been performed. Counselor Braith had not moved during this exchange. Now he leaned forward slightly in his position and said, I would like to read a passage from the Primordial Charter, Article 14, Section 3, Subsection 2, for the record. He did so, in the Charter's original language first, and then in standard translation, carefully, without emphasis. The subsection described the second condition of witnessing validity. The first condition was freedom of invitation from the recognized as species member, no coercion, no compulsion. The second condition was what the Charter called the capacity for witness in the unrecognized species member, genuine, non-strategic presence in the moment of contact, not performed, not calculated, present in the full and actual sense. The second condition, Braith said, has historically been the most difficult to verify. For this reason, the garden's monitoring systems established at the sanctuary's founding and continuously maintained and refined record not only behavioral data but biometric signatures across the full night cycle, including autonomic stress responses, voluntary muscle activity, and sleep state. He paused. I have reviewed the garden's records for the night in question. I will now summarize the relevant findings. The ethery legal representatives to the left of the sphere went very still. Mr. Vale's biometric profile showed decreasing muscle tension, beginning approximately 90 minutes after the two delegates entered the garden. Braith said, by midnight station time, his profile indicated full relaxation, not the reduced vigilance of a person maintaining a controlled presentation, but the complete metabolic signature of a person who had, for some period, stopped working at anything. His voluntary physical movements for the final 4 hours of the night cycle numbered 3. All reflexive, none directed toward or away from Ambassador Sariath. His sleep state monitoring indicates that he did not sleep. A brief pause. He remained awake, in full relaxation, in the position he had been in for the entire duration. Braith shifted the data slightly. Ambassador Sariath Velkaelin's biometric records show a voluntary spinduction attempt occurring at station time 11:43, which failed. What followed was an involuntary transition to deep, fully unconscious sleep at 11:51. The garden systems distinguish between these states with a high degree of precision. He set the device down. The second state, involuntary, deep unconscious sleep, is not one that ethery typically enter in the presence of unfamiliar individuals. Their autonomic nervous systems maintain vigilance responses during rest in unfamiliar company. The deactivation of those responses requires, under normal conditions, extended exposure to an individual who has been neurologically assessed as safe by the monitoring systems of the ethery neural architecture. This process ordinarily takes years. He paused. In this case, it took 4 hours. The chamber was quiet in a way that had a different quality from its previous quiets. The quality of something having been established with a thoroughness that left little room for maneuver. This does not address the question of initial intent, Vorkalin said from his elevated position. His voice was level. His eyes were very still. No, Braith said. It does not. That question remains before the council. He looked toward the secondary entrance. I would ask that Ambassador Sariath Velkaelin be brought in to address it. The doors on the chamber's right opened. Sariath crossed the floor to the secondary testimony position on the far side of the chamber from Marcus. She moved without hesitation, without the micro-adjustments of someone calibrating how they appear. She reached the position and looked up. Their eyes met across the chamber floor. He could not read her face clearly from that distance, but he thought he could read what was underneath it. She was afraid not of the council, not of the procedure, but of the more difficult thing, the thing that has no protocol and no governing clause, the thing you cannot argument your way out of. Ambassador Sariath Velkaelin, Braith said. Did you know that the Celestial Garden on Kelvith Station is the original sanctuary of witnessing? Yes, she said. Did you understand that spending the full night cycle in the garden, in peaceful coexistence with a member of an unrecognized species would fulfill the conditions for a valid witnessing? Yes. Did you choose to enter the garden on the night in question with that understanding? Yes. She didn't look away. I chose the garden. I chose the timing. I chose him. A pause that had weight to it. I did not choose everything that followed. Please be specific about the distinction. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it did not have the quality of a prepared statement. It had the quality of someone finding the accurate words in real time, because the accurate words were the only ones that were available to her. I made a calculation at the start of the evening, she said. I had been observing the human delegation for 2 cycles. I concluded that the case for witness status was strong and that the diplomatic path through conventional channels would not move quickly enough to prevent the limitation resolution before the assembly closed. I selected the garden as a mechanism. I selected a specific human delegate based on biometric assessment, the profile that indicated the lowest vigilance level in mixed species contexts, which I believed would produce the cleanest biometric record. She paused. That calculation was what I brought into the garden. Vorkaelin's legal representative moved to note this for the record. Braith noted it. Please continue. Sariath looked at Marcus across the floor, and Marcus looked back at her. And the distance between them had a particular quality, the quality of something that has been stretched to its limit and is waiting to find out whether that limit holds. The calculation stopped being a calculation, she said. I don't know the exact moment. I know that at some point during the conversation, I was no longer managing what I said. I was saying things I don't say in professional contexts. I was not monitoring what he said either, not assessing it, not filing it, not cross-referencing it against my existing data. I was simply listening to it, because it was interesting, because he was interesting, because the conversation was the most honest one I had had in 43 years of assessment work, and I don't know when that happened. I only know that it had already happened for some time by the time I noticed it. She paused, and then I fell asleep.
The chamber was quiet.
I want to be precise about what that means, she said. Etheri do not fall into deep, involuntary, fully unconscious sleep in the presence of beings they do not know. Our autonomic systems prevent it. The response I experienced, the deactivation of vigilance response. The involuntary transition that the garden's records confirm is not something I can produce voluntarily, and it is not something that can be produced in me by a calculation. It is a neurological trust response. It is what my nervous system does when it has arrived, by its own assessment, at the conclusion that the being beside me is completely safe. She held the silence for a moment. I did not calculate that conclusion. My nervous system reached it, and when I woke up, she stopped. He had not moved. The chamber was very, very quiet. Vorkalen's legal representative said, carefully and precisely, even accepting this account as accurate, the evidence before the council is that Ambassador Sariath Velkalen entered the garden with deliberate strategic intent to trigger the witnessing. The Charter's language on this point is clear. The invitation must be genuine. If the recognized species member's presence in the garden was initially strategic, the ceremony cannot be. The Charter, Braith said, describes the conditions for witnessing validity with respect to both parties. The second condition does not address the initial intent of the recognized species member. It addresses the quality of the unrecognized species member's presence in the moment of contact, specifically, whether that presence was genuine, non-strategic, and fully present. He looked at the Ethari legal representative steadily. The garden's biometric records and both testimonies this council has heard address that question. He paused. The question of Ambassador Sariath's initial intent bears on the first condition only the freedom and genuineness of the invitation. Her own testimony indicates that whatever her intent at the start of the evening, her neurological state by the end of the evening had undergone a transition she did not plan and could not have manufactured. Whether that transition satisfies the Charter's first condition is the question this council will deliberate. Vorkalen said, from the apex, his voice still completely level, I invoke my authority as High Speaker to request a procedural suspension of proceedings pending consultation with the Charter's legal stewardship body on the interpretation of first condition requirements. He said it the way someone says something they had prepared well in advance and had hoped not to have to say. Braith looked at him, a pause that was fractionally longer than a procedural pause should be. The request is noted and will be processed within standard review parameters. Proceedings are suspended pending the outcome of that review. The chamber began to clear. Marcus stood at the center of the floor and did not move immediately. Sariath stood at her position and did not move. Across the width of the chamber, they looked at each other, and Marcus thought that she looked the way she had looked on the bench in the garden when she woke, like someone who had gone further from where they intended to be than they knew how to account for, and who had not yet decided what that meant. Then the escort personnel came for both of them, and they were taken in separate directions. In the corridor outside the chamber, Vorkalen came down from the tribunal section. He stopped in front of Marcus, simply stopped, and stood there with his green eyes and his precise bearing and his face that was doing something complicated. He did not say anything. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, the look of someone who has spent his life managing outcomes and is standing in front of an outcome he did not manage, and then he walked away without speaking. That evening, Marcus received a formal communication. The procedural suspension would extend the hearing by an indefinite period, as determined by the High Speaker's review request. Sariath's delegate status was suspended pending the review's outcome, and the voluntary withdrawal statement was available to Marcus one final time, with the offer that if he signed before the end of station day, he could leave Kelvith on the morning transport. with no further proceedings attached to his record. He had until morning. Marcus requested a meeting with Vor Kalin and was moderately surprised when the request was granted within the hour. The room they used was a conference room in the administrative section Neutral Territory, selected presumably because neither side could claim it as an advantage. It had the indirect wall lighting of Athari preference, a table with 2 chairs, and a viewport showing a narrow slice of open space and the distant trinary light that made this system sky-specific and unrepeatable. Vor Kalin arrived at exactly the agreed time and sat down with the measured precision of someone for whom keeping appointments precisely was so long established that it no longer required effort. Marcus sat down across from him. He had, on the way to the room, prepared several approaches. He had thought about how to open, how to structure the argument, how to address the political concerns first and the personal questions second. Looking at Vor Kalin across the table, he set all of it aside. "Do you actually believe," he said, "that she didn't choose this herself?" Vor Kalin looked at him. His expression was completely contained, not closed, but managed, the way the face of someone very experienced at holding their position under pressure learns to be. "She chose to use an ancient and sacred mechanism," he said, "to extend galactic recognition to a species that the Council has not yet determined is equipped for that recognition." "She chose to spend a night talking to someone," Marcus said, "and she fell asleep. I know those are 2 different things. I'm asking whether you can actually tell yourself, when you look at your daughter, that the only thing that happened in that garden was a strategy. Whether that's what you actually believe." A very slight pause. "What happened in the garden," Vor Kalin said carefully, "is not
the question before the Council,"
Marcus said. "I know. I'm not asking you about the Council. I'm asking you about what you believe." The pause this time was longer. It had the quality of someone for whom direct personal questions had become rare enough to register as foreign objects, someone for whom almost every conversation had been professional for so long that the personal question required a different kind of processing. "My daughter," Vor Kalin said finally, his voice still even, "has sacrificed her standing, her career trajectory, and her relationship with every faction she was raised in for the benefit of a species that, for 200 years, and that your own historians will acknowledge, has not yet developed the restraint that 600 years of galactic stability have established as the minimum viable standard for." "She fell asleep on my chest," Marcus said, "after 4 hours of talking to me about things that don't appear in diplomatic assessments. And when she woke up, she didn't run. She testified, in front of the full council, about something that made her look like she was hiding something, because it was the truth, and she wasn't going to say something else instead." He paused. "I can't promise you anything about humanity in 500 years. I can't give you projections or guarantees or assurances. But I can tell you that I watched your daughter stand in front of that council and tell the truth about an evening that cost her every advantage she had, because she couldn't figure out how not to. And I think that means something. I think that's worth exactly what I think I'm worth, which is a species that also cannot always figure out how not to tell the truth." Vor Kalin was quiet for a moment that was long enough to not be a diplomatic pause. "What you're worth," he said carefully, "is not the question my people are afraid of. The question people are afraid of is what you will become." He said it without heat, without contempt. He said it with the measured clarity of someone who had thought about something for a very long time and had arrived at a position he believed and could not stop believing. 200 years of spacefaring, exponential expansion, a rate of change in settlement and development that exceeds every other species' early period by a significant margin. In 500 years, by the most conservative projections I have access to.
"In 500 years,"
Marcus said, "maybe someone will have been in the garden with us long enough to ask what thunder sounds like." Vor Kalin stopped. Marcus held his gaze. "I hear the concern," he said. "I am not dismissing it. I understand that from where you sit, with the models you have and the history your people have unfolded over 3,000 years, the concern is reasonable. But you're asking me to sign a document that says a real thing didn't happen, and the real thing that happened is the only evidence that exists for the thing you're afraid of being wrong about. And I can't do that." He paused. "You can deploy the withdrawal offer again," he said, "through formal channels. Tonight. I know you're planning to. I'll decline." And then the hearing continues, Vorkalen said. And the outcome is uncertain. And the relationships between human space and ethery space, which have been stable for 60 years and which provide practical benefits to your people, as well as... I know, Marcus said. I know all of that, and I still can't sign it. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, not posturing, just present, in a way he had not been present in any diplomatic space in 8 years. I'm not asking you to like this. I'm not asking you to change your position on these expansion or your projections or your concerns about the next 500 years. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself about what you saw in your daughter's testimony. Because I think, if you're honest with yourself about that, you already know that what happened in the garden was not only a strategy, and you already know that matters, and you are choosing not to know it because the knowing is inconvenient. He stopped. That's the choice that's yours to make, not mine. I'm just telling you what I can and can't do with mine. Vorkalen looked at him for a long time. Then he stood, very precisely, smoothed the front of his slow light robe, and said, I will be communicating the formal suspension extension through the appropriate channels this afternoon. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped, with his back to Marcus. You said that she couldn't figure out how not to tell the truth. He did not turn around. When she was very young, he said, that was the quality I was most proud of. A pause. It has remained inconvenient throughout her career. He left. That afternoon, the suspension extension came through. Vorkalen had filed the procedural authority order. Proceedings paused for 48 hours. Marcus's movement restricted to the administrative sector. Given station security protocols, requiring that detainees in pending proceedings not be housed indefinitely, Marcus would be escorted off Kelvith at the end of the restriction period if the proceedings had not concluded. Yaren found him in the administrative corridor 90 minutes later. She did not use a conference room. She sat down beside him on the bench that ran along the corridor wall, and the fact that she sat beside him and not across from him was something he noticed. There's still time, she said. Sign tonight. We're on a transport by morning. You have a story about a cultural misunderstanding that gets filed and forgotten in 6 months. Yaren. I know, she said. I know what you're going to say. I'm saying the other thing anyway because it's my job to say it. He looked at her. Is it? She was quiet for a moment. 22 years, she said. I became an ambassador because I believed that representing humanity in galactic spaces was the most important thing I could do. I have believed that for 22 years. I have made compromises for that belief, careful, reasoned, pragmatic compromises, and I have told myself at each one that the work requires them and the work is worth them. She looked at her hands. I have never, in 22 years, told someone not to sign a document that was going to make my job significantly easier. I'm telling you that now. She paused. Don't sign. See what happens. She left. He sat in the corridor, in the particular quiet of a large structure doing its continuous work, the ambient hum of the station systems at frequency, low and present. He had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when he became aware of footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor. Lighter than his, unhurried. He looked up. Sarieth was not supposed to have access to this section. He did not ask how she had managed it. She walked toward him and sat down on the bench beside him, not close, not far, the precise quality of proximity that says, I am here, and I am not going to require anything from you. They sat for a moment in quiet. The formal withdrawal offer came through the channels, she said. I know, I have been told, she said, that if you decline and the suspension extends, you will be removed from the station at the end of the restriction period. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to tell you something. About the garden, about all of it. She paused. The true version. Tell me. She looked at the corridor wall, at the indirect lighting that ran along it. I made a plan, she said. I had been observing the human delegation for 2 weeks. Your biometric profile in the shared space readings. From the reception hall, the assembly floor, the common corridors, was the most relaxed of any human delegate in mixed species contexts. I assessed that you were the least likely to do anything that disrupted the evening. I thought the plan was clean. A few hours of interaction that would read as genuine, which it would, because I intended to be genuine within the framework of the calculation, and then a monitored night cycle, and the mechanism would have functioned. She stopped. That is what I brought into the garden. And then, he said, and then you told me about thunder, she said, and I told you about the light ratio. A pause. I have never told anyone outside a ethery space about the light ratio. Not because it is classified, it is not classified. It is simply embarrassing, in a way that my people do not discuss openly. That after 900 years of trying, we cannot identify what we are missing. I told you because you asked in a way that expected an actual answer instead of a diplomatic one. She paused again. And then the conversation continued in that manner. And at some point, I realized that I was not assessing any of it. I was not filing what you said or cross-referencing it or adding it to the observation record. I was simply in the conversation. And I had not been simply in a conversation in 43 years. He was quiet, waiting. And then I was asleep, she said. Which I have explained. Which the garden systems have confirmed. Which is neurologically not something I can choose or manufacture or produce by calculation. She looked at the wall, and her voice when she spoke next was quieter, slightly unsteady in a way that his voice got unsteady when he was saying the true thing he hadn't planned to say. When I woke up, you had not moved. And I knew, before I fully understood where I was, before I was fully awake, that you had not moved. I could feel it in the quality of the stillness, in the absence of the micro-movements of someone who has been waiting for the situation to end. She paused.
You had been sitting there for hours, awake.
Not sleeping, not restless, not waiting for me to wake up so the evening could conclude. Just there. He did not say anything for a moment. You should have told me, he said, before we went in. Yes, she said, I know. Would you have? If you thought I would agree anyway. She was quiet for a while. I told myself that informed consent would compromise the biometric record, that if you knew the significance of the ceremony, your presence in the garden would register as calculated, even if you genuinely intended to be present. I told myself the deception was necessary. A pause. I think the true reason is that I was afraid. I wanted you to agree, and wanting you to agree meant I had already stopped calculating somewhere before I was aware of having started, and I was afraid to examine what that meant. He sat with this. Would you have agreed, she asked, if I had asked you, if I had said, there is this ancient ceremony, and I think humanity should have this status, and would you be willing to spend a night in the garden with me? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I would have been afraid. Afraid of getting it wrong. Afraid of it meaning something it shouldn't mean. Afraid of... He stopped. I would have found a reason. I'm very good at finding reasons. Then you would have regretted it. He looked at her. Probably forever, she said. Yes. She looked at him. The corridor was quiet. Neither of them said the thing they were not saying. The thing was present anyway, had been present since the garden, would continue to be present, regardless of what they said or didn't say about it. I don't know how this ends, he said. Nor do I, she said. That is also, for me, unusual. At the far end of the corridor, a door opened. Delegate Amy came through it. She stopped when she saw them. She was young, and her professional stillness was still a thing she was practicing, rather than a thing she had achieved. And what moved across her face when she saw them, two people, sitting on a bench in a restricted corridor, not performing anything, was the expression of someone who has been watching and has seen what she needed to see. She had been in this corridor longer than either of them had been sitting there. She had been in many corridors longer than most people realized, she said, in standard that was careful and deliberate, each word chosen. I need to file a formal procedural petition. I need a witness for the filing. She paused. A petition under Chapter 7 of the Ancient Charter, citing conflict of interest in the appointment of a presiding authority where that authority has a direct familial relationship with a primary party to the proceedings. She said it quickly, like something she had rehearsed and was now executing before she had time to reconsider. Vor Kalin has been sitting as both High Speaker exercising procedural authority and as the parent of the principal ether witness. The Charter's Chapter 7, provision on judicial neutrality, prohibits this. If the petition is filed and accepted, the proceedings cannot continue under his authority. A neutral authority would be appointed. The vote would proceed within 48 hours under the replacement council. She was looking at them steadily. Behind the professional stillness, something had the quality of a person who has decided that what they have observed is more important than what they had planned to observe while observing it. Sariath said quietly, Aini, you understand what this means for your standing within. I've been in this work for 7 years, Aini said. I was told when I began that the work is to observe and assess accurately. I have been observing. A pause. I have assessed. The petition was filed within the hour. The Charter's legal stewardship body, presented with a procedural conflict of interest, filing with Chapter 7 citation and 2 witness attestations, had no discretionary authority over the outcome. The conflict was either present or it was not. It was present. Vor Kalin was formally recused from all preceding authority within 3 hours of the filing. Councillor Braith was appointed sole presiding authority. The procedural suspension was lifted. The vote was scheduled for the following morning at the first session of the day. Marcus was not in the chamber for the vote. He was told the result by Yaren, who came to his room in the administrative wing in the early afternoon, and whose expression was not triumphant, and not simply relieved, but something more complicated than either, the expression of someone who has won something and is aware, in the winning, of the full weight of what winning costs and what it doesn't solve. 7-3, she said. Witnessing confirmed. Humanity has witnessed status under the primordial charter. He sat with this for a moment. The number had a shape to it, not overwhelming, not unanimous. 7-3 that he found more honest than a larger margin would have been. The galactic community had voted, and the majority had decided, and 3 had voted otherwise, and those 3 would continue to vote otherwise, and that was the actual situation. What does it mean practically? He said. The limitation resolution fails automatically. We have standing in all charter proceedings going forward. We are protected from population-level sanctions under the unanimity requirement. She sat down across from him, and 3 species have formally registered dissent, and they will continue to register dissent, and the work of earning what we've been given is a different work from the work of getting it, and it starts now. She paused. It's not the end of anything. No, he said. I know. She looked at him. Marcus, she said, I have been in this work for 22 years. I have watched a great deal of testimony in galactic formal proceedings. I have never watched testimony like that. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said, I just told them what happened. Yes, she said. That's what I mean. Sariath's delegate status was formally reinstated technically by the end of the day. She stepped down from her position 3 hours after the reinstatement. Filing her resignation under a formal statement she wrote herself, she cited the need to operate without factional affiliation and the recognition that her work going forward could not be done from inside the ethery diplomatic structure without compromising both the structure and the work. She would remain on Kelvith Station as an independent observer for the remainder of the assembly. The cost was real, and she had chosen it, and she did not ask anyone to tell her it had been the wrong choice, because she already knew whether it had been. The morning before the human delegation departed, Marcus returned to the garden. The attendant let him in without comment. The evening cycle was running deep blue-black overhead, the almost stars in their too perfect arrangement, the amber trees pulsing in their individual rhythms, the seed clusters chiming. The basin of light reactive fluid was cycling through its slow, continuous shift between one version of itself and another. He walked to the bench by the basin and sat down. The garden was very quiet. Not the quiet of an empty space, but the quiet of a space that is full of things that make no sound, which is a different kind of quiet, the kind that feels attended. He sat in it and thought about nothing in particular, which he had not done in 8 years and which turned out to require almost no effort at all when the circumstances were right. He had been there perhaps 25 minutes when he heard footsteps on the pale stone path, lighter than his, unhurried. Sariath sat down beside him. She had not announced she was coming. He had not told her he would be here. They had simply, as it happened the first time, moved toward the same place because there was nowhere else that made more sense and found each other there. The garden held them in its quiet. The basin reflected the ceiling's almost stars back upward, so they were at the center of a doubled sky, artificial in both directions, and somehow truer for it. He thought about saying things, about the vote, about what came next, about the work that was just beginning, about the 3 who had voted no, and the things that needed to be earned, and the long conversation that humanity had entered and could not leave, about all of it. He had a great deal to think about, and in the ordinary run of his life, he would have thought about it continuously, because that was how he had lived for 8 years, continuously thinking about the next thing. He let it all wait. After a while he did not register how long, and did not try to. Sariath leaned her head against his chest. He felt the weight of it, specific and familiar, as particular as a sound or a smell, as distinct as anything he had ever felt. He did not move. In the garden, the lights pulsed, in their slow, continuous rhythms, the trees, the vines, the basin's surface shifting between one color and another, the seed clusters chiming in the circulation currents. The monitoring systems did their quiet, ancient, thorough work. Neither of them paid any attention to that. They sat in the warmth and the quiet and the particular smell of growing things. Two people who had stopped performing long enough ago that the absence of performance had become its own thing, not nothing, but something. Something that did not have a name yet in either of their languages, and probably did not need one. Outside the dome, the trinary light of this impossible system painted the starfield in its unrepeatable blue gold.